Hello and welcome to the Providence College podcast. I'm Michael Hagan from the class of 2015, and I'm joined by producer Chris Judge of the class of 2005. The Black Studies program at Providence College was launched in 1995 and is celebrating its 25th anniversary this academic year. This year-long celebration is centered around the theme of remembrance, resistance, and revolution. Dr. Zophia Edwards, Assistant Professor of Sociology and Director of the Black Studies program, is here with us today to discuss the program's history, the principles and methods of Black Studies, and learning and activism both in and out of the classroom. Dr. Edwards, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
So Dr. Edwards, the Black Studies program, like I said, was launched in 1995, and student activists and faculty allies are credited for its creation. What needs were these activists addressing that weren't being met in existing programs at the time?
This is absolutely right. The Black Studies program was launched in 1995, and it was really in response to some problems that actually students have said still continue to this day. So a group of students at PC came together to talk about some issues within the curriculum, that basically there was a curriculum where students of color were not seeing themselves represented. They were either not seeing themselves represented or not seeing their histories fully and accurately represented. And so these students came together with their faculty allies, and they decided to push for a Black Studies program to be created where students of color, particularly Black students, could study their history, culture, and basically the experiences of African and African descended people in the world. And it was also a response to the marginalization of students of color and other marginalized identities on the campus of Providence College at the time. So in addition to curriculum issues, it was also a response to community issues and a way for students and faculty to build a program that could also have as part of its mission, building community and offering space and place to elevate the voices of students of color and other marginalized identities on this campus and foster embeddedness between Providence College and the greater Providence community, for which at the time and also continuing into today felt very disconnected. And so I would say that those two factors were perhaps among the largest or most pressing issues at the time that the program was being implemented to address, and that is gaps in the curriculum and also a way of building community.
So tell us about the scope of Black Studies. What sources does it draw on, and what are its methods?
This is a great question. So Black Studies is essentially the study of the history, conditions, and experiences of African people and African descended people across the diaspora. So from the outset, Black Studies was to transform higher education, chiefly by addressing the limitations within the curriculum, particularly Eurocentric paradigms in the curriculum, to center the study of people of African descent within even the university canon, and to link academic teachings and scholarship with social and civic engagement. And so these are some of the core principles or the scope of Black Studies. It also is centered by sort of this quest to raise critical questions about the purpose of knowledge production and the nature of truth claims. And, you know, these questions are very central to what how Black Studies approaches questions in the world. In terms of methods, it is also interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. So it combines different approaches from the humanities and the social sciences, which actually, in fact, most colleges and universities in the United States now actively promote as a key to higher education in the 21st century, right? So, you know, Providence College itself has long been talking about sort of interdisciplinary programs and interdisciplinary approaches. And this is also in the Providence College to PC 200 strategic plan as something that the college is working towards. And Black Studies is already that, right? So it has encompassed a wide range of approaches to these topics that are studied, and that includes art, culture, religion, women, gender and sexuality, health, politics, the society, and economic policy. So these are some of the many approaches and methods that it draws upon within the discipline.
So it could probably be said that almost all U.S. colleges and universities, with the notable exception of historically Black institutions and maybe a few others, were late in dedicating resources to the study of Black history, heritage, and voices. Compared to other schools, though, how late or early was Providence College in establishing this kind of a program?
So Providence College started the Black Studies program in 1995. But the vast majority of programs and departments in Black Studies, or later then called African American Studies or Africana Studies, those were first created in the 1960s and 70s, actually, right, as a result of student and faculty activism across those campuses. So the first Black Studies program, as we know it today at a university, was in 1968 at San Francisco State. And, you know, they hired Nathan Hare to write a proposal to be the first department of Black Studies. And it officially became a department in 1969. And so, you know, it goes back several, so PC, you know, in 1995, was a few, you know, a couple decades after the first Black Studies program had been established in the US. And I mean, the student activists on our Facebook page, we have a video recording of one of our events that we had this academic year for our anniversary, and it was called Movements for Black Studies. And one of the students who was one of the activists who created the program and helped write the curriculum for the first Black Studies program at PC was Ross Grace. And he talks about, you know, the whole process of how they wrote the curriculum, how they had meetings with administrators and so on to create this program at PC. So it was a couple decades after the first you know, the first Black Studies program in the US, but, you know, it's never too late. So it's a good move, yeah.
As a note for our listeners, we're going to include links to the Black Studies departmental website as well as social media channels in the show notes, so you'll be able to find the video that Dr. Edwards referred to there. So Dr. Edwards, who were the pioneers of Black Studies as a distinct field?
So Black Studies as a distinct field actually goes way back. If we think about sort of modern higher education, it goes way back to academics and intellectuals like Anna Julia Cooper and W.E.B. Du Bois, Oliver Cromwell Cox, C.L.R. James. These people were real pioneers in the study of African and African descended people in the modern period. And they are American. They are also scholars from other parts of the world. So for instance, I quoted Oliver Cromwell Cox and C.L.R. James, who are both from Trinidad and Tobago, which is also the country that I am from. So I always have to throw them in there as real pioneers. But if you've read, for instance, the Black Jacobins, which is the first documented historiography of the Haitian Revolution, this was written by C.L.R. James. These texts were, published in the 1930s, and Du Bois had been writing much earlier, even in the earlier 1900s, and so it goes far back. And then it is sort of revived as sort of a distinct field of Black studies, a distinct discipline where these authors are read by people like Carter G. Woodson in the 1960s and 70s, who really thought about how do we build a curriculum, how do we educate people in this distinct field. And so these are some of the prominent names that you'll come across if you take a Black Studies course, but also as founders of the discipline.
Could you say a little bit more about the bedrock principles of the study?
At its very core, Black Studies really is focused on the experiences, as I said, of African and African descended people. And in order to approach the study of this group, Black Studies is necessarily historical, right? That's one major principle, is that it is deeply historical. We historicize those experiences. We look at the longue durée because we understand that what we see in the world today as the conditions and life for Black people, not just in the United States, but around the world, it didn't start recently, right? There's a long history, a long historical evolution that led to this particular point. And so Black Studies necessarily goes back. We look back in order to understand how we get to where we are today. It is also global because the people who we call Black in the Americas, they're descended from people who we call Black in Africa and Africans. And so we connect those relations always. We connect those experiences through how we approach the study of these groups. So it is necessarily global. Not just the connections between people, but the connections between countries, the connections between places, right? And so how is Europe connected, or what we think of as Europe today, connected to Africa? How is Europe connected to the Americas? And what is produced out of those connections? What kinds of, not just material things, but ideologies and ways of treating people and so on. And I think the third principle that I would also emphasize is for Black Studies, we focus on, or we emphasize something that we call your standpoint, which is your particular identity or your particular experience is a starting point for an investigation, for systematic scientific investigation. And so the notion that we can study anything without bringing ourselves to the table is, sort of something that we challenge, because recognize that everybody brings something to the study of the world, right? Everybody has a perspective, everybody has a lived experience. And so recognizing that and incorporating that, or acknowledging that in how we study the world, is very important. And so, and I can actually circle back to this point because I think it's a really important one in how Black Studies approaches investigations. But lived experience is not something that is negated, but is seen as very much embedded in the structures, the history of the society that we're trying to understand. And another principle, or another core element that is studied in Black studies is Black resistance. And that kind of ties into actually our theme for the 25th anniversary, right? Remembrance, resistance, and revolution. It's because from the moment that Africans were captured in the transatlantic slave trade, from the very moment of capture, before capture, the fight, there was always resistance. And this is something that has been overlooked in other disciplines, has not been emphasized, and it is very much a core component of Black studies. What was that resistance? What form did it take, right? The multiple forms in which you can resist. You can down your tools, or you can, march and protest and demonstrate in a variety of ways. And so we look at the full gamut of what Black resistance looks like, studying that, making sense of that, understanding that, and also participating in that, right? Because that is a core component of the discipline of Black studies, is not just to study the world, but to be engaged in it. So, yeah.
When you talk about Black studies being inherently global, it draws to mind a term that you often hear, particularly in studies that focus on a particular identity or a particular experience or shared experience, and that's the idea of intersectionality. Could you define intersectionality and say a little bit about its origins in academia and its theoretical underpinnings?
Intersectionality, in the way that we talk about it today, has been mostly kind of popularized. The term has been popularized by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is in the field of law. And, it emerged in sort of the 1970s as sort of a correction to Black studies, which was erasing the voices or underemphasizing the voices of women, and a correction to women's studies, which was, didn't want to address race. And so these Black feminists, right, who came up with the idea of intersectionality, wanted to probe these silences, these erasures and distortions and complexities around the experiences of people of African descent around the world. And so Kimberly Crenshaw was popularized this term, but it goes, the theoretical underpinnings, as the way you put it, right, of the idea of intersectionality goes further back to people like Claudia Jones, who talked about sort of the triple oppression that Black women face, according to race, gender, and class, right? So Black working class women being sort of this uniquely oppressed group in our capitalist society, right? And even further back to, like I said earlier on, people like Anna Julia Cooper, who wrote a text in 1892 called A Voice from the South by a Black Woman from the South. And so these authors, these Black feminists, were really engaging with what are the multiple layers of oppression that Black women face because of their positionality in society as a particular race that is oppressed, a gender oppressed, and an oppressed class group. And so through that lens, we are able to understand how different kinds of identities, different intersecting identities, produce different experiences within the world and produce different outcomes for people based on their unique positionality. So this is, where it started, but it has also allowed for the study of how race and gender and class, for instance, intersect with legal status. And so there's a lot of new research coming out, for instance, about how your citizenship also intersects with these identities to produce particular kinds of oppressions, right? For women of color and women of color who are not US citizens, for instance. So, yeah.
So say I'm a student enrolling in my first Black Studies course, Black Studies 101. What might our first few classes look like, and what kind of sources are we reading?
Oh, this is great because I love this class. I love teaching Black Studies 101. And our newest faculty member who just joined the Black Studies program this academic year, Dr. Ashley Smith Purviance, also teaches Black Studies 101. And so if you take one of our classes, the first few classes, we start really at a fundamental level, pretty much similar to how this interview started. What is Black Studies? So the first thing we look at is sort of what is this discipline? What do we study? And what are the origins of the field, right? And the core principles of the field. So we go through that and we read about, the student movements that gave rise to Black Studies as programs and departments across the US. And then we kind of frame this as, okay, now we understand what Black Studies is and where it came from, but who do we call Black? Which is always a very interesting question because I think it kind of catches people off guard. Like, well, what do you mean? Who do we call Black? Like, obviously, the people who we call Black are Black people. Like, what do you mean? And so we actually use that as a starting point to step back and ask, well, there are a lot of people who, quote unquote, have Black parents, but don't have the physical characteristics of someone who you might consider to be Black. And so are they not Black? How do we think about physical characteristics? What is race? How do we categorize people in particular races, right? What does that look like in the US versus Brazil versus South Africa, right? Versus in the Dominican Republic versus in Haiti? How do these ways of classifying people shift and change? And what does it mean to be called Black in these different contexts? And we, of course, look at that within this overarching understanding that race and racism is very much linked to white supremacy and capitalism and colonialism, right? So we look at all of those connections and so on. And then we really delve into what do we know about these people that we call Black? And for most students, well, I know about slavery. That's the starting point, right? I know about slavery. I've studied that, I know. But what if we start before slavery, right? There were African societies, African civilizations before European contact, all right, what we call contact, European colonization. So what do we know? And we study basically pre-colonial African history. Some of the great cities in Africa, how society was organized in different kingdoms, what these kingdoms looked like in terms of political structure, in terms of culture, and in terms of markets and trade, right? We study all of those things. And then we slowly move into sort of the period of industrialization, which is characterized by the transatlantic slave trade and slavery in the Americas. So we look at what that looked like, what structured that, what was the role of violence in this and all of that. And then throughout the course, sorry, to add to this, which is a very important dimension, we look at Rhode Island's contribution to the transatlantic slave trade, Rhode Island's role in that, which actually was a very prominent role that Rhode Island played, right? As one of the centers on the triangular trade route, right? So we study that history, and we might even take a tour of Rhode Island, of Providence, where you can see some of the main sites that were, part of the transatlantic slave trade process, right? And so we do all of that. We look at the unique position of Black women in slavery, in the slave trade, right? Being uniquely and particularly exploited. And then we kind of move slowly into the modern, more contemporary period, but always linking it back to these very historical logics, right, of racism and labor exploitation. So we look at media, we look at criminality, we look at music and the arts, race and sports, and we also look at Black feminism and intersectionality, and how, as I was saying, your unique positionality shapes how you experience the world. And we will end that course looking at, or throughout the course, but really focusing on the end at movements and activism and resistance. And so we read pieces by Marcus Garvey, we read MLK and Malcolm X, and we read about these prominent figures in not just US history, but around the world, Amilcar Cabral, right? We look at Black movements all around the world to get a picture of what resistance looks like, to study that resistance, and to always remember that tradition.
So we finished Black Studies 101. We're eager to learn more. There's 15 more credits to the Black Studies minor. What will the rest of the course of studies in the Black Studies minor look like?
So for the Black Studies minor, you have to take 101 plus 5 additional classes. And those classes, 3 of those classes have to cover the themes within the Black Studies minor. So the 3 themes that we have are culture, language, literature, and the arts. And within that group, you have courses like the history of jazz, or African-American artist, or African worldview, which counts as a course within that thematic area. The second thematic area is historical inquiry. And within that, you can take courses like social movements or African American women. And then a third area, thematic area, is social and structural analysis. And we have courses in there where you study basically the structures of society and how systematic patterns impact particular people in different ways. And so you can get in these classes, race and politics in the Americas, race and racism, urban sociology, the power of whiteness, and faith and spirit in the Black family and community. So those are some examples of courses that you can take. So it's really, as I said, interdisciplinary, right? So you do history, culture, and structure. And it covers a wide range of different disciplines. So
how many departments offer courses that are cross-listed with Black Studies?
So we have a lot of departments that cross-list courses, namely sociology, political science, English, history, social work, music, and global studies. And also, we are looking to develop new areas of cross-listing courses. For instance, this year, we're doing a cluster hire in Black Studies. And so one of the positions that we're hiring for will be for Black Studies and Health Policy and Management, which will be a new area for us. And we're very excited about that, especially in this global pandemic of COVID-19, which is disproportionately impacting Black communities and other communities of color. We see this urgency, this need to address race and healthcare systems and race and public health in our curriculum. So this is one area that we're really excited to be growing in.
That's a really exciting expansion for the program. For students with the majors or in the departments that you mentioned, Black Studies may seem like a very natural minor because of all of those cross listings and the similar methodologies. But what about students in, say, business or the natural sciences, or up until recently or the near future, health policy, or other majors with few cross listings? Why is it important, indeed, perhaps particularly important, that a Black Studies program be available to them?
Yeah, I love this question because I think it is crucial, especially in a liberal arts college, that students engage with the discipline of Black Studies, because it has so much to offer in terms of critical thinking, right? And how do we know what we know? How do we come to that knowledge, right? Why do we believe the things that we believe? Black Studies helps us to interrogate those questions and to learn how to almost instinctively ask those questions about the world. Why is this the way that it is, right? And so developing that critical eye is an essential skill for students and people to have, right? And just also a fundamental sense, we study the modern world. You learn about the relationship between our economy and colonialism and racism, how they work together to impact different groups of people in different ways, right? We learn about how we can see the parallels, but also the distinctions with other marginalized and oppressed groups. And learning to see these systems and these patterns and understanding the history of resistance to those exploitative patterns is, I think, essential reading, essential skill for any student who says they have graduated from a liberal arts college education, right? I mean, I was an astrophysics major when I was an undergrad. And I loved it. I loved my major. I loved the work that I was doing. I've studied, my focus was on solar eclipses. And so I was doing all this fabulous, like really amazing work, like running around the world whenever there's a solar eclipse, trying to study all the details of that. But now I'm flashing back to that time when I was, chasing eclipses, which is very fun. But even in that discipline, which we might think is so far removed from anything, one of the questions that continue to stand out to me is, why doesn't astrophysics in the US have more Black astrophysicists? Where are the Black astrophysicists? It's not that they did not exist. It's not that Black astrophysicists, it's like an impossibility. After all, the first universities were in Africa, right? The people who were some of the most, the pioneers in what we know today about stars and the solar system were from those universities, people studying at those universities. So why are they marginalized now? Why don't we see more Black astrophysicists? And what impact does this have on the knowledge that is produced in this field, right? Those are questions that Black studies can help us to answer, right? So it just helps us to better understand the world that we are living in and how we can better navigate that world, not just as a Black person at all. In fact, any racial identity, race gender grouping, or, taking Black studies helps us to understand how the world is, how it came to be like this, and our position and our role in that.
So what are some of the most interesting major and minor pairings that you've seen with the Black Studies minor?
Yes, so we have basically some, as you said, sort of some very natural pairings, or pairings that kind of, really come together because, one, there was a long-standing relationship between some of these departments and the program. And two, we have faculty who have been very active in teaching in the program or working with students from these programs. So that would be sociology and anthropology and women and gender studies, for example, global studies, right? Recently, these are sort of, your sort of natural pairings you might think of with Black studies. But there are some also pairings that we might think of as less, as a little more surprising and, or newer, I guess, to the program in this way. And those are music and Black studies. So for instance, we have, of course, the history of jazz, and that course is a very popular course taught by faculty in the music department. And you study the history of this musical form, its, emergence in the US, and what kind of social climate and social conditions it was linked to, and so on. And then also, like I mentioned, health policy and management and Black studies, which allows us to investigate in more detail the role of race and racism in the health system and in health outcomes. So why do we see the kinds of disparities that we see in terms of different health measures and health indicators across racial groups? And so this is very exciting new terrain for us within Black Studies at Providence College, particularly in this pandemic, because it was always there. We we always had, racial disparities in health and so on. But I think this particular historical moment elevates it to the fore, right? And we see the urgency of needing to study this and address these deep structural problems, these deep historical problems in the United States.
You mentioned the history of jazz course. I have fond memories from my senior year. I didn't actually take history of jazz, but my roommate did. And while I wasn't, going to class with him, he'd have outside of class field trips where he'd have to go to a jazz performance, and he'd bring me along. So I actually got a really nice kind of secondary music education through history of jazz. So I recommend that course to anybody who might be interested. So Dr. Edwards, Black Studies students have been at the forefront of activist movements on our campus for years. Could you tell us about some of these movements through the years?
Yes, absolutely. So I came to Providence College in 2015. That's when I started. And when I started, there were protests on campus around racism, racial exclusion, sexism on campus, and homophobia. These were all questions that students, or issues that students were raising as something that needed to be addressed on this campus. And in the spring semester, I believe, is when student activists went to Father Shanley's office, and they occupied his office for 13 hours, asking him to commit to engaging in some kind of action to address institutional racism and other forms of exclusion at Providence College. And so these students were really at the forefront of these movements. Hopefully our listeners will be able to look at our Facebook page and see the video of PC Break the Silence movement, which Black Studies hosted to commemorate those protests in 2015, and the movement which gave rise to the 2015 student demands. And so hopefully people will be able to go and listen to that, because it's really, really a lesson for all of us in what it takes to make change, to have social change on this campus. I had mentioned to you that we are now, Black Studies is doing a cluster hire. So there will be 3 new positions in Black Studies, jointly appointed with other programs, other departments. But this is exclusively because of the students and the pressure from students over the years. That big push in 2015 to make this happen. And then in 2020 again, when George Floyd was murdered, and there was a wave of Black Lives Matter protests across the country. I remember I was sitting I wasn't sitting, I was virtually logged on to a faculty senate meeting, and student activists came into the meeting, logged into the meeting, and started voicing their concerns and voicing the consistency of these issues that have been going on, the persistence of these issues that have been going on campus with respect to racism and exclusion. And so, a lot of our students who have been most active or who have participated alongside with their peers have been Black Studies minors. And I think it is because they are actively engaged, right? They've learned all this history. They've learned about the legacies of Black resistance all over the world from, pre-colonial times to now. And so they are engaged, they're tuned in and turned on to what is going on in the world, and the urgency of getting involved to do something about it. And I think that has been one of the most joyous things about working in this program, is to be working alongside students who are so involved and so committed and so energized. And it's been a real pleasure. And I will say that, through the course of talking to students who are enrolled at PC right now, and comparing that with what students have said in the students of 1995, so like Ross Grace, who I was telling you about, who talked about the issues at Providence College in 1995. And at one of our events, an alumni from 1990, the class of 1988, was saying, this is really similar to what we faced when we were students here. And, the goosebumps that you get, that, it's an ongoing struggle. People have been involved for a long time. People have been committed for a long time. And it's only through that continuous involvement that there will be any change, right? And so it's been really exciting.
There's certainly much more work to be done. How do students carry their experiences as activists back into the classroom or into their research?
Mm-hmm. So students carry their experiences into, I would say, all aspects of their academic lives and personal lives in a variety of ways. A lot of, for instance, class projects that students want to work on come out of the fact that they, saw this social issue as really pressing and really important, and they really want to work on that. They really are inspired and want to do something about this. And so they work on that in their class papers or their activism projects, So in Black Studies 101, students all have to do an activism project. And even if they aren't aware of what specific issue they're interested in, because you have a variety of different students with different interests, and some people just don't know what their passion is, or if they have any passions, right? And so they discover that over the course of a semester. What do I want to engage with in this world? And so I've seen a wide range of projects that come out of student activism that either they've brought from being activists outside and come into the class, or activism that has developed from the class and going into the world. So I've seen students produce documentaries, for instance, on Eurocentric beauty standards and how that impacts people at Providence College and in the student community. I've seen projects that have tried to raise awareness about the relationship between Providence College and the broader Smith Hill community, right? And that has taken the form of Instagram pages. I've seen students do really phenomenal work with discussion boards and focus groups and town hall meetings, petitions. And so all of that energy and also anger about, injustice is really channeled in really creative and interesting ways.
So you've clearly established the importance and the value of the Black Studies program at Providence College. But the Black experience also cannot exclusively be the purview of a Black Studies program. Could you say a little bit more about efforts to elevate Black voices in other academic programs? Where have there been successes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a really great question, because I think especially in this moment of Black Lives Matter and our efforts to address systematic racism in society, and for our purposes in a PC also within higher education, this is really crucial, right? How do academic programs and departments, how does academia try to address systematic racism within their curriculum and their institution? And I think that there have been some interesting openings at Providence College, and it'll be really interesting to see where these things lead, right? What it would be the actual outcome of these efforts. Because we have to remember that for every effort to make change, there is resistance to that change. There are people who don't want change. They don't want something new. They don't want something different. And so it's always a struggle and it's ongoing. I've heard about conversations going on in the development of Western civilization program, for instance, about how they can reform the curriculum to include more Black voices in the curriculum, more people of color, more authors of color, and things like that. And we will see, we have to keep attuned to what's going on, because I think a lot of students have continuously for years, right? For years, they have talked about the need to reform this program in particular, because every student at Providence College has to go through DWC. So, we hope that there will be some changes in this direction. I would just say on this point too, that we have to be also very careful, because there's been a lot of buzz around using the word anti-racist and to decolonize. So now everyone wants to decolonize everything. And my concern is that these have now become buzzwords that institutions are using. We want to create an anti-racist curriculum and we want to decolonize, but using these words without actually changing the structures is very problematic and is actually not going to create change. And so for every, one of these initiatives that I see, I'm always asking, well, where's the structural change behind this? If we want to decolonize the curriculum, then we really need to do some hard work here on identifying where are the sources of white supremacist ideologies, and so on in our curriculum, and how to get rid of that. And if we're not willing to do those difficult things and make those difficult choices and changes, then things will stay the same. And we can talk about this, we can have lectures and seminars and so on, and nothing will change. And so I'm always very cautious about what is being said versus what is actually being done.
Now, as someone who as a student myself couldn't make up my mind as to what I was going to study, so I just kind of studied a little bit of it all. I love to see the proliferation of interdisciplinary studies and programs like Black Studies. Now, these kinds of interdisciplinary programs, they're a little new in the academic world, or newer than some of more traditional disciplines. And many students feel pressured to major or minor in fields that are more traditionally thought of as career preparation. How can students with an interest in Black studies communicate the definite value of this minor in Black studies or a similar interdisciplinary program to those who might be skeptical of it?
So I would say that on one point that, Black studies is an old discipline. It's been around for a very long time, but it has been marginalized. And so while it's been there and it's been available, the books have been written for hundreds of years, because it's been sidelined in higher education, this is part of the reason why students don't understand the value of it, right? And so the value of a Black Studies minor is in one's ability to critically engage with the world and to critically activate oneself in the world. And this is transferable. This is a skill that is transferable to any area of interest, right? It's actually a core orienting principle that you will guide anyone who's, engaged in any field. And so, if you are in finance, you need to understand how race operates in finance, right? And so it is these tools that Black Studies offers enable people to approach the world in a particular kind of way, in a critical kind of way, and not just to accept what is told, but to question what is told and to really engage based on a historical and a global understanding of capitalism and racism.
No, I'm sorry for the suggestion in my question that Black Studies is a relatively young discipline. Thank you for the correction there. Where are some of our Black Studies alumni now?
Yes, so this actually ties in with your last question, right? About what is the value of this. So we have Black Studies alumni in a wide range of fields. So even before this formal, joint position in Black Studies and Health Policy and Management, this formal faculty position, which will be starting in the fall of 2021. Even before that, we have a lot of Black Studies minors who major in health policy and management and go into the fields of nursing and other healthcare professional fields. We also have Black Studies alumni. Another big area actually where our alumni go is in education, higher education. A lot of our alumni want to become deans and administrators so that they can advise and mentor students of color through their getting their degree. And so that's been really exciting because I think it mirrors some of the mentorship that they also received while at Providence College, or perhaps lack of mentorship that they want to now, be a different kind of mentor to someone else. So these are two areas that are really big for our Black Studies, our Black Studies minors. We have students who go into law. So for instance, right now I'm writing letters of recommendation for students who are applying to law school. I have students who have gone into, I already spoke about health policy, but also in the area of medicine. So I have students who have gone into dentistry and medical school. And so it's a wide range, We also have students who go into grassroots organizing work with local organizations, either in Providence or in New England generally. And so they've really been able to find enriching work in those places. So it's a wide range, which only, again, I think demonstrates the point we were making earlier, that Black studies is versatile, and it is of value even if you don't go on to get your PhD in Black studies.
So I have one personal question where I'd like to circle back to something that you mentioned earlier, and that's that you did your undergraduate degree in astrophysics, which is fascinating. Could you tell us a little bit about your path from astrophysics to sociology with a focus on Black studies?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. So I'm walking down memory lane now. So I majored in astrophysics at Williams College. And I majored in astrophysics because in my home country, Trinidad and Tobago, your high school education is very much specialized. So you're tracked really early on into a particular field, and that's your path. And so I was in the sciences. And so when I graduated from high school, I just thought, I'm going to college, so obviously I'm going to continue with the sciences. So I took chemistry and biology and physics. I ended up really liking physics, and I took one astronomy class, and I was sold. I was like, this is awesome. I want to, continue with astrophysics. And then for my junior year of study abroad, I went to Australia for the year. And, I also was able to travel to different countries around the world during that study away year. And I had always been interested in inequality, but really being able to travel around the world as a Black woman, and really experience and see the links between sort of race, gender, and inequality around the world was really eye-opening for me. And I couldn't really look back once I had that experience. While I was in Australia, I got to take a lot of classes about Indigenous people in Australia and their experiences, the history of colonization in Australia and so on. And I just couldn't look back from trying to understand, so why are some countries more wealthy than others? Why are Black people oppressed all around the world? Why are people of color, why are Indigenous people marginalized around the world? These were the questions that I became absorbed with. And I came back, and I only had one more year at Williams College because I was a junior when I went on study abroad. So I finished my bachelor's in astrophysics. And after that, I said, I need to figure out what I want to do. This is a crisis, a quarter life crisis. What do I do? And so I decided to think about it for a couple of years. I taught middle school science and elementary school science at a school in New York City. While I was teaching, I attended classes at NYU and just dabbling in political science and public policy, trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And then I went back home to my home country in Trinidad, and I worked as a research assistant for a documentary on CLR James, who I mentioned was one of the pioneers in Black studies. And so through that documentary, I got to learn a lot about not just his writings, but the discipline and how we can study, colonialism and why it is that some countries are wealthier than others and what produces that. And so I decided, what? I really want to study this. I want to understand this question. And so I applied to graduate school, and I decided to go to graduate school in sociology. And my area of focus has been the study of race and colonialism and development. And that inevitably I had to read a lot of Black studies scholarships. So that's kind of the intersection of the two and how I got to that point. So it was a long road, but I got there, and I still use a lot of my, of course, analytical skills that I gained in astrophysics, because I still do a lot of quantitative research and a lot of quantitative work. So it still is very useful to me. But, it's a path that I had to take. I always tell my undergraduate students, right, where we start off today is probably not where we're going to be 5 years from now. And so, that's really exciting. And we just have to kind of take it as it comes, where our path leads us.
Well, Dr. Edwards, I'm thankful that path led you to Providence College. You're doing important work in and out of the classroom and inspiring students to fight for racial, economic, and social justice. Thank you for joining us on the podcast today, and best wishes to the Black Studies program in its next 25 years.
Thank you so much.
Subscribe to the Providence College podcast in all the usual places, including iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play, and Spotify, as well as your smart speaker. If you like what you hear, please review and share with others. Thanks for listening, and go Friars.